month's webinar. I hope you can hear the audio properly. If you have any issues, please type in a question in the Q&A panel. This is Hemant Alhans. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. The topic today is the planning for user story gold. So the content we'll cover today is to help how to really focus on delivering value by splitting user stories. We often find when we work with various Agile teams that they often get stuck in this, sometimes because of the waterfall nature of the thought process or sometimes otherwise, so some thinking limitations, where they end up thinking coming up with larger stories and get stuck not being able to split them into smaller, higher value chunks. And that comes in the way of not only not allowing you to focus on delivering business value early and often and all, but also not allowing you to keep the team in sync where QA ends up waiting till the developer is done and all that. So a lot of negative things happen if you're not able to split stories very well. So today we're going to address this topic. We have done a similar webinar before, and this is another iteration to attack the same topic. For presenter, I'm delighted to have an excellent expert, Damon Poole. He's a repeat presenter at these webinars. I'm going to introduce Damon in a few minutes, but let me just cover some housekeeping topics. So we'll run the webinar as usual for just about 45 minutes of presentation time, and we'll take some questions along the way where they make sense. And then we'll leave another 10-15 minutes at the very end for taking general questions related to this topic. And then, of course, we'll, as usual, make the document that we are using today available to all the attendees on this webinar. So with that, let me introduce Damon. So Damon is actually founder and president of Valtivity, an Agile coaching and training consulting company. And as I mentioned, he's been on these webinars several times with us. He has 20+ years of experience covering both small teams as well as large globally distributed teams, helping them adopt and practice Agile practices. Damon was president of Agile New England from 2008 to 2010. He writes frequently on the topic of Agile development and is the author of the web book, Do It Yourself Agile. He's actually a pioneer in the area of multi-stage continuous integration and mixing Scrum and Kanban. I've heard a couple of times at least his presentations at the Agile conference, which is usually standing room only. He has spoken many conferences. I've had the chance to attend only a few, I think. Damon is also the co-founder in the past CEO and CTO of Acura, where he created multiple award-winning products, including Acura and Acura Workflow. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Damon, to take us through this topic.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction. So first off, why split user stories? There's a lot of reasons to split user stories. Among them are the fact that smaller stories are easier to get done within an iteration if you're using iterations, and you have sort of less leftover time at the end of the iteration. So it's a lot easier to get things done if they're small. Also, it helps with the focus of getting things done rapidly. Much rather have 8 stories done at the end of an iteration out of 10 that you plan to do rather than 10, 80% done. So small stories helps with that as well. But really, today we're going to focus on the economics of this and the fact that by splitting stories, you'll actually make more money and reduce your costs. So let's take a little bit of a look at that. So often in the development world, especially in an IT shop as opposed to product development, but it can happen in all kinds of markets, there's a focus on operational efficiency, and that's absolutely important, and that's something that folks like Sinners can help you with. But we also want to look at the value. What can that team that you're going to have internally or externally do for you? And with an Agile team, there's an opportunity to deliver more value by splitting stories. So if you look at a product that you're going to develop and you have multiple approaches, the cost is definitely an important factor, but you want to also look at the value. So the ideal, of course, here would be low cost, high value, something like the folks at Sinners can provide for you. Another part of that is, in order to tune the stories and focus on the value and split them, you really need to know your market and customers very well And if you have an internal business user that you're thinking of as your customer, in reality, that's not really your customer. You want to work, you want to have a cooperative interaction with them so that you really think of yourself as not the business and IT, but rather as one group providing an offering. So if you think of a financial fund, that the website is often the way that that's managed as far as sales, marketing, interaction, everything, managing your funds. And so the more that the IT group understands the market, can work with the business to produce things, the better off everybody's going to be, including the customer. That gives you an opportunity to very quickly get feedback on something and realize, you know what, the market doesn't really like this. It's a good thing that we didn't spend 2 years putting this together. So I like to start out with a concrete example, pun intended. And so this is a bridge. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Most people that are not from the Boston area say, "Hey, isn't that big dick, the big dig?" So I think that's what that is, and maybe there's some problems with the big dig. And so actually, it's called the Zakim Bridge, and the Zakim Bridge is a bridge that in the Boston area is fairly well known, but outside of the Boston area is actually not well known. And part of the value of this bridge was supposed to be the fact that it was an iconic or cultural landmark. But if people don't even know what it's called, then I'm not sure that succeeded from a business perspective. Now, if you think of that bridge on the west coast of the United States, let's see, what's that called? That famous bridge. Oh, right, the Golden Gate Park Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge. Everybody knows that, so that succeeded. How this relates to software is often we put things in our requirements that we hope people will want or we think people will want, but that they actually don't want and don't use. And we spend a lot of time doing that, so we don't find out until the end. So there's this principle in Agile called the simplest thing that could possibly work. And if you look at this bridge, there's actually a bridge just to the left of it, which pretty much serves the exact same purpose, but doesn't have as much in it, right? It's not an architectural marvel, it's just getting the job done. And in Agile, one of the approaches with the simplest thing that could possibly work is, it's true. You don't know what your customers and users are going to use in the future, so don't guess, actually. Put things in as you discover that they're useful and find out as you go. And one of the reasons that we end up putting a lot of stuff in is because with a long release cycle, if after a year we give something to somebody and they say, well, you forgot about this thing that's now obvious, you feel a little sheepish. So you want to put as many things in there. You want to guess what might they want. And unfortunately, very often we guess wrong. So let's look at the cost of this bridge. Right, so, and there's this thing here too. What's that? I don't know about you, but if I was a civil engineer, I would not want this bridge in my portfolio. It looks like I made a mistake. Now, in speaking to a civil engineer, he explained about flow patterns and eddies and why they did it. And I asked, well, if that's important not to intermingle traffic, why didn't you just make the bridge wider and put another barrier there like you have in the middle of the north and south going lanes, the main lanes? And he said, well, I don't know. So the interesting thing about this bridge is because of that, it also makes it more mathematically complex, which means that it's more expensive, it's a more difficult structure to build. And the bottom line here is that it was $11 million per lane. This boring bridge that nobody's ever heard of is $5 million per lane. It is the simplest thing that could possibly work. And if we total that out, if you want to build 10 lanes as the bridge on the left, and you could have a series of bridges or however you would do it, that's a pretty big savings there. So if you look at, if you have a portfolio of projects and you can think of it this way and build the simplest thing that could possibly work, you give it to somebody and they say, you know what, I thought I needed more, but this is good, you're going to save a lot of money. Now they may turn around and say, you know what, there's 3 more things that I need, and you can rapidly give them those 3 more things and not all of the other things that would have just been guesses. So now you can use that savings to start other projects and that sort of thing, or close down a project. Nobody wants it. You built the simplest thing that could possibly work. They're not interested. Stop right there. So how that translates into splitting user stories is that the way, one of the main things that everybody knows about Agile is that you have a backlog. And what is a backlog but saying, this is the product I want to build, here are the things that are the most valuable to the least value, and I'm going to do it in iterations. And it may just turn out that when I look at it, I realize, you know what, this will be the first release right here, and I'm going to leave out the last 2 stories for the first release because they're not as valuable. And if I give that to a customer and they say, you know what, this is all I need, or now I need something that I hadn't thought of before, you've reduced the cost of getting to that point because you didn't build those 2 things, had some discovery, and added more value. Right? So really what a backlog is and user stories are splitting right there. Right? You're taking a huge user story, the whole product, breaking it up into pieces, doing the things that you think are the most valuable first, and leaving the things that you think are least valuable to the end, and you may never get to them. So if that's good at the whole product level, why not do that on a story-by-story basis? So let's look at a user story. Here we have an 8-point story. Well, if I look at it at that and I think, okay, that's very valuable and I want to do that, it's going to cost me 8 points. Okay, it is what it is. But what if I could split it? If I can split it and I split it like this, and it turns out that most of the value comes from the 3-point story and there's almost no value attached to the 5-point story, and it doesn't always split out this way, of course, but if I can split something out, why not? Now I'm very tempted never to do that 5-point story because it looks like the value is not going to outweigh the cost. Right? So for 5 story points, what does that cost? I don't know, but you can actually calculate it, and we'll look into that later. What is the value? Again, nobody knows. You don't know what the value of a user story is until you start realizing the value because you're giving it to customers and they're returning value to you, whether as reorders, new orders, budgets, however they deliver value to you. So it's all relative, and that's why we use the backlog to put the things of highest value at the top and lower value towards the bottom. So really, the way to look at this is think of it as scratch tickets, right? Because calculating the cost is actually easy and predicting value is hard, you want to have a lot of small bets that you're making. So I don't know how much I'm going to get back from this story, but I'm pretty sure that this story is more valuable than that story, so I'm going to do the more valuable story. And you know, this is a very big bet. I'm going to make it smaller bets and choose which of those bets to take and when. There are really 2 main approaches here. You can make more judgment calls about smaller things because it's a lot easier to make judgment calls about a bunch of small things than it is one big thing. You know, think about it this way. Which would you rather decide on? $50 million project A versus $50 million project B, or make much smaller bets, $10,000 bets, $100,000 bets, right? Because you're going to learn as you make those bets and get the return from those. So making more judgment calls about smaller things is good, and that comes out with, you know, splitting. Getting more feedback on the direction sooner, again, you need to split and have small stories so you can get them done sooner, so that you can get feedback sooner. And also related to that is often people talk about minimum marketable features. I'm not sure there really is any minimum. I think if there's something that somebody somewhere can use, that is the minimum marketable features, and it may actually be a 3-point story or even a 1-point story. As an example, working with a financial institution, a very large financial institution, what they do is they know that their employees are also customers, and so they have a little bit on the customer ID that says whether or not they're an employee, and they make some new features available to just their employees. They get feedback from the employees, and if it goes well, they roll it out, and if not, they work on it some more. So there's a lot of things you can do, even if you think, well, I'm not sure that's marketable yet. I think actually everything is marketable to somebody so that you can get feedback and figure out that direction sooner. Lastly, reducing cycle time. So small cycle time means that you have a process that can get things out quickly, and that works really well with smaller user stories, because if you have a process that can get things out quickly, but all of your stories are going to take a month, then you really can't do anything quicker than a month. So let's look at the cost, because I mentioned that cost is important. And generally thinking about the cost of a user story or requirement is something that is very rarely done because it's just so difficult to figure that out. But thanks to Agile, we can do this. Now, it does assume that you have a few things, a backlog, that you're using user stories, story points, iterations, and that you know your iteration length and how many story points you get done in an iteration. So you need to know your velocity. But if you have that, and you can go to your controller, your CFO, or somebody like that, and figure out what is the annual cost of a sprint team or an Agile team. You know, you're not necessarily using Scrum, but whatever you're using. If you know the cost of that team, and that also assumes that they're, a dedicated team or mostly dedicated, figure out what is the cost from that person. And this is a team that I profiled. I went to the controller and I said, how much do they cost? They said, and he said, right down to the penny, here's what it is. Well, I knew their iteration length, and that means I knew how many iterations they did per year. I knew their velocity, and this can vary, right? It can vary over time. So that's why you want this to be their average, and it can go up and down over the year. But it gives you at least a ballpark that you can use. I knew their overall velocity per year, and I could just divide one by the other. Now I know how many dollars per point. That allows me to make decisions like when I was working at Acura, a salesperson came to me and said, hey, I have this deal at Verizon Wireless for $41,000. They just want a couple of things. And I said, oh, what do they want? And he said, well, they want these very reasonable things. It was like 1 feature and 3 bug fixes, or maybe the other way around, I forget. And I was able to go to the development team and say, hey, these are actually all valuable things that we want to do at some point anyway, but we have a customer that might want them. Could you estimate out these stories and defects? And they did. And it was 5 story points total, so $7,000, $7,000 to get 41. And also they were stories that I knew other customers would want. Easy, easy. Now these sorts of things don't always fall in your lap, but knowing the cost per point can really help you figure out, is there value in this story? And this also comes in useful in another place, which I'll get into in a moment. So let's get into some of the meat here around splitting. What are some of the ways that I can split user stories? So let's say that I want to compete with SurveyMonkey. I don't, but let's say I did. So I have an online survey system that I want to create, which means anybody can create surveys for free. So that's not really breaking it down. But one of the things that you can do is you can split by number. So look for numerical things in your stories that you could split and say, you know what, instead of all, maybe I can do a specific list or 1. So really this is saying multiple users with multiple surveys. Another way to split it would be multiple users, a single survey, single user, multiple surveys, or even a single user and a single survey. Now you might think, well, that's not going to have a lot of value. I mean, I can have 1 customer and I can do 1 survey. There's always a use for it. And building that infrastructure for even a single story is you're going to learn a lot. You're going to realize, oh, wow, I didn't realize the fact that we've got a firewall we're going to deal with, and we're going to make a database choice here, and it turns out that the development team doesn't have a lot of experience in this area. There's a lot that you can learn just from that, and then you can build on top of it once you've built the foundation for the single user story, then building on another one, etc. So in this example, for instance, if I'm building an online survey system and I've got it working for a single user and a single survey, great. I could be that single user. I could use the survey system to survey people out on the internet to see what they even care about in an online survey system. So there's always a way to do it. Now, how could I break that down? That sounds pretty simple as it is, right? Well, not really, because what kind of things do you want to do, right? You need to create the survey. Somebody needs to take the survey. Somebody needs to look at the results. And then even with creating a survey, right, there's deleting it, updating it, all kinds of things. So that gets us into the next method, which is create, read, update, delete. You can often break things down into that pattern and say, okay, which of these does it make sense for me to do right now? Now, one quick thing is having a piece of functionality that allows you to create a survey. Do you want to create a survey? Do you want to do something else? Well, that's the only thing that the system even does. So asking you, would you like to create a survey, doesn't make a lot of sense. So we can just take that story right out at the beginning, right? So you want to look for opportunities to take out things that you don't need right now. Another one here, and what's very common with create, read, update, and delete is that updating can be dropped. Well, how can I drop updating? Well, simple, right? I have create and delete. So if I want to update, I can delete and then create again. Now, that might not be something that you want to put out in the wild, but if it turns out that, you know, your survey system is, you know, asking just true false and that nobody ever really makes mistakes or updates it, you know, maybe that's enough for now. But it's definitely enough during development to get it up and running so that somebody can test it, look at it, and say, wow, that is just fantastic, keep going. Or, I'm not sure that this is what I was expecting. Let's tweak this a little bit. Once you've got that going and you've got that, you know, built and running production quality, then you can add in, you know, the other stories. So another very tempting thing to do is to split work along technical lines. And this is generally where people start out with their user stories. And it's understandable, right? A lot of people go down this path. It does actually have value, but I want to let you know that it is kind of a red flag, right? Splitting work along technical lines, while a typical place to start, is not where you want to end up. So I can think of having in my system a front end, the middle layer, you know, so I've got the UI, I've got Tomcat or something, and then on the back end I've got, you know, SQL Server, and I've got stored procedures and triggers and that kind of stuff. Whatever you have, you probably have multiple layers, one way or the other. So I can think of breaking this down into, you know, I'll exaggerate a little bit here, but let's imagine that I'm doing a weekly iteration, and each of these tasks would be 1 week. Yay. So now I can do each one in 1 week iteration. But the problem with that is that each iteration is not shippable. And in Agile, especially in Scrum, we want to have each iteration shippable, production quality, something that is valuable to the user, something that I could give them and that they could use. So having a story implemented that accepts a question in a text box but can't send it anywhere and it's not actually usable, that's not a lot of value. So that's not the right approach to take. Now, there is actually a case where you can take that approach and it is useful, which is what I call splitting by grafting. So grafting is the idea that rather than building, so let's say you've got an old system, you want to replace it with a new system, and you believe that not until you have the whole functionality can you release the new system, right? So that's another good place where grafting comes in. So that's taking something new and adding it to an existing system. I'll give you another example from Acura. In going to a new backend database, one of the things that they needed to do was replace the replication system. And then an engineer said to me, well, you know, I can see how to do replication in 2 months, but 1 month, I mean, come on. And Acura at the time was using 1 month iterations. This was years ago. But, you know, so I struggled with that. And I thought, you know, I don't know the answer to that. But we went through a couple of different examples of how to split user stories. And one person raised their hand and said, hey, would there be any value in, well, I don't know. So we've got, you know, the old database and the new database. What if people could use the old database, use the old, use the regular replication, use the same transport mechanism, the same APIs and all that kind of stuff to transfer the data over to what it thinks is another system that's, you know, the old system. And then it receives that data, the new system receives the data and puts it in the database, but does not have to do the work of sending it to another of the new databases, right? So basically, pretty much half the work. And I thought, wow, that's brilliant. Not only that, but customers can say, all right, I'm going to use the new database and try it out with replication. And if anything goes wrong, I've still got everything in the old database and I can remake the replica and I'll figure out any performance issues, any bugs, reliability. So that was a big win-win. Another way that you can do that is, for instance, let's say you're creating a new UI, you're going from, you know, a typical desktop application to a thin client. Then you can, you know, especially if you have a service layer, you can take and add new functionality in the web without having to have all of the functionality by grafting that functionality onto the old system, right? So that's a great way to split things technically, but to still have value that the customer can use. Okay, so how would we split that original story by value? One of the obstacles to splitting user stories is actually a sort of a belief or a philosophy that efficiency of development is the most important thing. And it is important, but actually it's not the most important thing. Business efficiency is the most important thing. Getting something of value that you can get revenue from, or whatever the value, business value of your organization is, back, that's actually more important. So if you have to redo some code, that's okay if you're getting more business value. And here's an example. So a surveyor wants to create a question. I've broken it down into true-false question, free-form question, multiple choice question. And let's just say that these are complicated and have changes that need to be made at, or new functionality needed to be added at all of the layers. So we got front end, middle, and you can see there's a lot of overlap here, right? So in the front end there, I got the purple and the blue overlapping. So if I don't do it all at once, I'm going to have to rewrite some of the code for one or the other. And that seems inefficient, right? It's going to take me longer than if I just did it all at once. But what if it turns out I can do just this one, and I've got a very valuable, product, truefalsesurveys.com. And you might be thinking, well, that's kind of a contrived example. What business is actually going to do something like that? Well, how about Twitter, right? Twitter, you can think of as just the status updates of LinkedIn, right? So, is LinkedIn without all the other stuff, just the status valuable? Well, I think Twitter would say yes, right? So that's the way you want to look at it, is can I build value with smaller things, and then maybe some of these things that I thought I needed to do, I never have to do. Something new comes along. I haven't already spent a whole lot of time on doing things I thought people needed. Now I can spend that time on things that I know people needed because they're asking for them. The other side of that is that the code that you never write is actually the most valuable. Okay, another way to look at splitting work by value. So this is an example. Hallmark is not a client, but I was not able to use the client's screenshots, and they were actually a financial institution. But Hallmark has sort of a similar example to what I'd like to show here. So let's imagine that the business or the customer has asked for something very complex. Like, I want customized cards, a lot of different kind of cards, I want a whole bunch of delivery options, and I want to see a proof of the card. So I've just shown a couple of pieces of the workflow here. But you can see that kind of looks like a lot of work, and you can imagine there's back-end work and all that kind of stuff. If your team velocity is 20 story points, and you end up with these 5 stories, right, you don't actually have a shippable, increment of work here. You're going to have to do, what are you going to do to get that out into the market? It's 25 points, and you've only got 20. Well, one of the things that this team did, again, not Hallmark, that they did was they said, I'm going to put a whole bunch of this stuff into a story called error checking. So the stories on the left there had no error checking in it, and then they were able to get it done in the iteration, but they couldn't actually ship it. They had that functionality turned off, and then they finished it up the next iteration, and then they were able to ship it. So this is not an atypical way to look at it. This is very common to say, okay, well, I don't know what to do here. There's multiple steps. I'll break them up into user stories, and I'll do each one at a time. It's a good starting point, actually. Not a bad place to start. But really what Agile is saying is, don't think of it as, I have to do the finished product right away. This is okay, right? So out of all of the cards that you might be able to or want to send, and all the customizing and all of the delivery options and all that kind of stuff, just saying, you know what, hey, we're happybirthday.com. You say who it's to and the address, we'll send the card out. We're not even going to charge you. I'm not going to show you what the contents is, but we've done a promotion, and it's from a famous greeting card company, and so you can trust that it's going to be good. We're not going to do anything wrong, right? So, and let's say it's a 3-point story. Boom, you got it, right? You have something now. This is something that you can show that people can get value out of, and maybe you just use it for internal customers. You say, hey, we're thinking about doing, moving out into electronic delivery of greeting cards or greeting cards period, and we'd like to test it out, see what you think. So people can try it, and then you figured out things like, what's the backend database going to be, what language you're going to code it in, or whatever, right? You've very quickly built something that works. Then once you've got it working, now you can build things onto it, right? So once you have that happy birthday card, right, and you wouldn't pull out the error checking into a separate story. Right now I can do person wants to select a card to send. So I can pick birthday card, hope you get better, but still you can't customize it. There's no delivery options and you don't get to see a proof of the card. Now I'm thinking maybe having a proof of the card would be the better place to start. So I'm going to do that 5-point story so that people are like, oh, well, that's a good birthday card. That's what I want to send out. And then maybe they can customize it, and then maybe they can select the delivery options, and then they can select new cards once we've got that up and running. That's what we're thinking of when we're talking about splitting stories. Each story that you split into should be something that the customer can get value out of. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the way that you want to be thinking about it. And practice really makes perfect here. Okay, so another typical way to split up user stories is by acceptance test. So you may have a story like, this is for something like Tripit. I don't know if you've used Tripit, but it's great. Even if you've never used it, you can just send something to plans@tripit.com, like a hotel booking, and it will create an itinerary for you. If you send them the car and the airplane, and it figures out that the dates are overlapping, it creates one trip for you, puts it all in one place. Just fantastic. I use it all the time. So let's say that you had a story, traveler wants to send a travel email to the site. And I will know as the product owner that it's working when it handles a hotel booking, an airline booking, and a car booking. Maybe it'll handle other things, but these are the 3 things that I'm going to test. Okay, well, if those are the 3 things that you're going to test, I could split it up into 3 separate user stories. So a couple of things you'll notice here. 5 plus 5 plus 5 does not equal 8. That's kind of mysterious math. How did that happen? Well, when you're estimating smaller things, you tend to get more accurate. People think things through a little bit more and realize, oh, there's going to have to be customized parsing there, and they have, the airlines have much longer emails and all this kind of stuff. That's good, actually. That's good news. You're going to have more accuracy, and you're going to be able to give a better estimate and understand what you're going to deliver much better. But it also means that you may find that doing just one of these stories is actually the most valuable thing. Maybe marketing says, you know what, we're doing a whole lot of work with hotels right now. We don't actually have a whole lot of airline or car rental agencies that we're working with, so we can put that off. And maybe you never get there. Maybe you become something like hotels.com. There's good business there. And then you can keep working on this and say, okay, emails from hotels, I'll accept it when it works for Marriott, Hilton, and Motel 6. Well, hey, there's 3 new user stories, right? And you keep doing that. Now, at some point, it may start to become, diminishing returns, and the story is getting too small, and it's actually more work to split it than it is to just do it. Okay, so I've talked about a bunch of story splitting techniques. There are others, right? So we went down to the acceptance test use case. Many companies use use cases already. Take a look at the use cases that have been enumerated for doing something. And if you look at those, maybe one of them all by itself has value, and you can think of, oh, hey, there's 10 use cases here, and 5 of them actually have value all by themselves. There's 5 new user stories. These other 5, well, they're sort of, error cases or special cases, and nobody cares about those all by themselves. We'll have to do that as part of the other stories. But use cases, a great way to look at. It's a great place to look at for a source of potential new user stories. If you have the word "and" in there or a comma, that's probably multiple stories. Another one is going sideways, and that's sort of the example that I was giving earlier with the Hallmark cards. Is that so if another way to do that with the Hallmark cards would be to say, you know what, there's somebody that I always send a card to, so let me set a frequent recipient. And then I've done a lot of the work of saying who is the recipient and all that kind of stuff. And then the next thing that I could add would be send card, right? So it's not going to ask me who to send it to. It's just going to send it to the frequent recipient. And you might think, well, I never actually asked for those values. No customer asked for that. That's true, but at least you can implement those things. They are usable by somebody, And even if you decide not to market it or ship it, you've at least built something that works, that you can test, that you can show to people and say, you know what, this is a good base of things to build things on. So actually sometimes going sideways and looking for things where you're making progress towards it, but it's not exactly a straight line towards where you're going, enables you to build up that base of things that you're going to need for the other stories that you really want to get to. Lastly, constraining effort. That's actually one of my favorite ones. So, okay, here's a user story for 8 points. What could we do if I only had 5 points? And, you know, the company's going to go out of business if we don't get it done. You've only got 5 story points. What could we do? And then that gets people thinking like, you know, maybe we don't really need the print-friendly button right away. We could take that off, and then we could, we don't really need a graphic here. We were going to get some graphics in there, and we could sort of leave that off. It gets people thinking, what could I pull out of the story that I don't really need? Okay, now you got a 5-point story. Okay, is there something we could do with 3 points? Is there something we could do with 2? Is there something we could do with 1? And that's a really great way to get the juices flowing, get some brainstorming going, and have people think about different ways to approach the same goal. So beyond story splitting itself, there are other things that go along with it, which is to be aggressive with story splitting. Right? So often when Agile team is starting out, they do all of their story writing and backlog grooming during the sprint planning meeting. Well, that's probably not the best time to do it. Actually, you want to be writing stories, grooming the backlog, splitting stories all the time. Right? And just to illustrate that, you know, you're pulling stories off the backlog and implementing them on a regular basis. You should be pulling stories out of the backlog and splitting them on a regular basis too. Now, you know, when I animated this, I forgot to have big numbers turning into small numbers, but just imagine that those are all 8s turning into 2s or something like that. But you get the idea. You want to be pulling stories out, splitting them into smaller pieces, and then putting them into the right place in the backlog on a really regular basis. Okay, now this is a little complicated looking, but work with me here for a moment. So when
you go on the next one, can I take one question which is related to something you just covered?
Sure.
This is you covered just now a few slides ago, splitting by acceptance test. So this is a question that I thought I might as well inject it right here. So the question is, while using acceptance tests for splitting, I end up in multiple acceptance tests exactly matching the user story. That is, no difference between the user story and the test for it. Is it good or bad?
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So the smaller the story, the better. Absolutely. If you get down to 1 acceptance test per user story, great. Okay, so what should I do with a story? This is actually beyond splitting. There's also stories you ought to avoid from an economic perspective. So if you have something that costs more than it's worth, then why would you do it, right? So this is just saying anything that costs more than its value, don't do it. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, I can't do that. You know, I've got this manager that came in and said I had to do it, and it's actually very expensive. I'm not sure I see the value, but he says we just have to do it, and you know, whatever. Well, okay, now you can have a conversation with that person and say, this is what it's going to cost. Why do you think it's worth that? And then you may discover something that you didn't know. Or that person might say, oh, really? That's what it costs? You know, I think I agree with you. We shouldn't do that. Or they might say, well, you know, there's not a lot of value, but it's for this particular customer that gives us a lot of referrals. And that's how we get all of our customers. So from that one customer, they're amazing. So while the story in itself may not seem to have a lot of value, there's a lot of value to the business. Great, okay. So then actually the value is much higher than you thought. Okay, so now it's on the right side of actually doing it. The other thing that I would say is if it's over 3 story points, now you might think, well, where did you come up with that, right? So different teams have different story point scales. Why 3 points? Well, bear with me for a moment. I'll get to that. But if it's 3 story points or higher, you really ought to think about splitting it. So instead of the graph, actually, I have this much simpler 2 points, which is avoid stories that cost more than their expected value and split any story over 3 points where possible. Now, why 3 points? Well, what I find is that over time, that teams gravitate towards realizing that a one-point story is the kind of story that they do on a regular basis, and that they're pretty good at splitting. So, you know, one-point story, they do a whole bunch of them. A 3 is 3 times as hard. A 5 is 5 times as hard, right? So if it's 5 times as much effort, it really makes sense to see and invest some effort to see if you can make it into smaller stories, and avoid doing those pieces, you know, those stories that you broke out that actually have less value than their cost. So that's where that comes from, is that in general, many teams gravitate to the point where, you know, they're mostly doing 1, 2, and 3-point stories, and sometimes they have 5, 8s, and 13s, and those stories you really want to break down, especially the larger ones, because probably that means you're not entirely sure how to do it or what it is. Okay, so another thing that you can do is reduce cycle time, right? Reducing cycle time is very important. And that's another place where getting the story smaller is valuable, because the smaller it is, the quicker you can do it, and the more value you can get from a feedback perspective, but also from the market. So Don Reinertson talks about the cost of delay of a product, and what this really comes down to is, let's say that you've just now decided that you want to come out with a tablet computer. Just think of all the money that Apple has made from their, you know, iPads over the last couple of years. The fact that you waited till now to do it for whatever reason, because you wanted to vet out the risk and, you know, all that kind of stuff, all of the opportunity, all of the money that you could have made, that's gone. Not only that, but it's probably going to be pretty hard to catch up with them. So I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in getting into that business. So that's one of the costs of delay. But the other is the delivery delay. Let's say you know there's an opportunity and you want to do it, but it's going to take you a year before the user can use it. Well, so if you look at this is showing over time how much value can come out of that feature, right? You never know exactly what it is, but you can think about it. You can, you know, do a thought experiment there and say, I think this will be valuable in the market for 2 years or something like that. But if you think it's going to be valuable in the market for about a year, and it's going to take you about a year to do it, why would you even start it? It doesn't make any sense, right? So you want to be thinking about, what is it going to cost me to delay getting this feature out there? And the converse is, what is my opportunity if I can get it out there sooner, right? So that really speaks to having as small of a user story as I can possibly get. I'll give you an example, again, from Acura. You know, back in the day, we used to, at Acura, they used to say, well, so, you know, you've used CVS or something like that. It doesn't really understand your process, but you know, you got a process up on the whiteboard, and you can put it into Acura, and it will model that process, and it makes it simpler to move things from this stage of development to that stage of development. And people said, I don't get it. What do you really mean by that? And we'd say, oh, well, you know, just visualize the ability to take this whiteboard and, you know, move it all around. And of course, you have to do it at the DOS prompt because there's no UI for that part of it. But people got kind of confused and really didn't have a lot of interest. So sales were just okay. Then Acura came out with a visualization for what they were talking about, and sales really took off. The price of the product doubled, but revenues more than doubled. And we went back to them and we said, wow, you know, why the interest in the product? And they said, oh, well, it's that one screen right there. That's, you know, the stream browser. That's what really made the deal for us. And the interesting part of that story is that that feature was part of a 1-year release to replace the old user interface. Like, that screen was done in the first month. So if we had been able to release it in the first month, that could have brought forward, excuse me, that could have brought forward that increase in revenue by 11 months and given them a more competitive place in the marketplace, right? So that's an example of what that can do. Now, if you're used to Scrum, right, the way that Scrum works is you take an increment of work, you work on it, you get more work from the customers, of course, you get it to done, and then you ship it. But that's a month, right? A lot can happen in a month, actually. And a lot of people these days are going to something called Kanban. Kanban allows you to ship something as soon as you get a story done. right? So you can take in these constantly changing stories, get it all the way through your process to done, because actually getting a story to done quickly within even a short iteration of a month or two weeks, that's more important than getting it all done within the iteration, right? Because you get to the end of the iteration and sometimes all the stories magically go to done somehow. I'm not sure exactly how, right in the last day or two. That's really not a good practice. You don't get as much testing in there as you want. So whether you actually ship it or not, the idea is let's focus on getting stories to done. And if they're small, it's going to be easy. And after every story we get done, it's actually shippable. Now you might think, well, I don't know what product or project this is, but it must be small. I've actually worked with customers that have used this on a very large scale, many Scrum or Kanban teams, and a mix of Kanban and Scrum teams all working together, and it does actually scale. And in fact, in many ways, the scale is better than multiple Scrum teams. And how to go to Kanban, that's a whole different topic. But the idea here is that if you've gotten to small user stories and you're getting them done on a regular basis, then you can deliver new versions of your product very rapidly. And I'll give you an example. There's a book called Lean Startups. You may have heard of that, by Eric Ries. And he started a company that has taken this to the extreme. And it's the one company that I know that does this at this level, but they release product 50 times a day. 50 times a day. It's amazing. But what they're able to do from that is, as they put out a new release,
I'll bring up my PowerPoint so we can prompt for questions. Give me a minute, folks. You can see my screen now. Okay. So at this point, give some thought to the content that Damon just covered, and we already have a few questions, but you can add more questions to it, and we'll start taking questions. While you're doing that, let me just take a couple minutes and cover Synergip overview in the meantime for those of you who don't know us. So Synergip in a nutshell, we do these webinars once a month, so this is about us. We are a software product development partner for small to mid-sized technology companies. We help these companies essentially do Agile product development work as an extension of the in-house team. For each client, we put together a team of high caliber professionals, and that serves as a logical extension of their in-house team, completely seamless. And by virtue of our expertise in software development in general and Agile practices in particular, we are able to actually reduce the risk of software development and delivery. We are able to bring the right practices and bring the right balance of discipline that is needed for each client. And then in addition to reducing the risk, we are also able to reduce significantly the cost of software development because of not only our process and efficiency expertise, but also the fact that we have a dual shore operation with a development center in India as well as a small team on the US side. So that benefit we pass on to our clients of economic advantage. And lastly, we offer flexibility to our clients of converting the team that is working for them at Synergip into their captive team whenever they feel like it. So those are the 5 points in a nutshell about Synergip as a software development partner for small to mid-sized technology companies. The next page has a refreshes on your screen, there's a lot of logos, is just a glimpse of some of our clients. You see some of the names hopefully you can recognize, but almost all small to mid-sized companies, a few large companies here and there. So with that overview, let's now come to taking questions. So Damon, you ready? We have a few minutes for a few questions, and we have a number of questions here.
I'm ready.
Okay, all right. So let's take first one, which is I often hear that a backend team or a database team finds it very difficult for them to break what appears to them a all or none or kind of atomic big chunk of work or story, and therefore not being able to split. I mean, is that a legitimate, real situation where that happens, or is there something wrong the team is doing?
Well, I would actually break the question into two pieces there. So one story is, one story, that's funny. One question, question splitting, next webinar. So one question is, I often hear pushback from developers that that's already an atomic story, I can't make it any smaller, and that's not uncommon. And I think it really gets, down to practice and, saying to folks, no, you really got to try. It is worth the effort. And so leaving off the database for a moment, just getting to that question, I would say that often, as I mentioned earlier, part of the pushback is I don't want to split the story. It's not I don't see how to do it. It's I don't want to, and so I'm not even gonna start. Right? Because I believe that if I broke it up into smaller pieces, I need to do them all anyway. So why would I split it up and make it more efficient? And that's really something that is hard, a hard habit to break. But the thing to remember is that it's not about the technical efficiency, it's about the business efficiency. And if you can find a way to split up a story so that pieces of it don't even need to be done, or that you can validate the technical approach, or that you can get feedback from the customer early, those all have tremendous business value. And remember that you want your business to be successful because that's how you get paid, right? That's where your raise and bonus and vacation and all that sort of thing. And the how interesting the project is that you work on, that's where those things come from. So that's one of the first things that typically I see. The other one is it's really practice, right? In the past, if you had a 6-month, a year or whatever delivery cycle, and you had something that you thought that's going to take about a month, you didn't need to break it down, and that was fine. There was no value because there was no audience or forum for getting that feedback earlier, right? It's just not something that we've done. So, that muscle, if you will, that skill is not built up. Agile says, you know what, there's a lot of value from doing that. So let's build that muscle. Let's practice. Let's do what we can. And I think, some of those questions come from not knowing about what some of these techniques are that you can break up stories. Now, when it comes to, the database team, sometimes in some of these questions, right, there's the sort of, I wouldn't say red herring, but there's sort of another way to look at this issue, which is that some of these issues come up not because of the fact that the story can't be split, but of an organizational thing that hasn't happened yet. And often I see that there is a separate database team. Well, think about Agile in the first place. When you first went Agile, if you have gone Agile, you had the QA silo and the development silo, and now you have, QA embedded in development, right? And that has a lot of value. Same with the database folks. To the extent that you can, having that database person on the team means that you're not looking at how to break down a database-specific story, right? I would question whether or not there is such a thing as a database-specific story. Is there a story that, maybe there's one about optimizing an index, right, so that the throughput is faster so people are able to do more business with you, perhaps, right? But really, at the high level, what is that user story? And having the database person part of implementing that story is probably where you're going to see the most value, right? But really getting down to, let's say you do have a database team and they do have a story and it does have value to an end user somewhere. Often, you've got the fact that you've got the data modeling and the ETL and all that kind of stuff, and that those are very, phase gate kind of things. Even then you can say, well, let's all get together and talk it through first, instead of saying, all right, I'm going to do the data modeling and then we're going to do the ETL stuff. Let's get together first and brainstorm on, are there any ways that we can break this down and at least be understanding what's coming down the pike so that when I get it, I've already got my questions answered, and so that it's going to go faster. So that's really what I have on that topic.
Okay, excellent. Let's take another question, which is sort of what you're, I think, beginning to talk about. But so, who should be actually responsible for this constant story splitting activity? Is this pretty much a product owner role? Because after all, product owner is responsible for backlog grooming and so on, or is this a collaborative exercise like iteration planning where everybody's sitting around